So thank you very much for the very kind introduction. I should have read the program. I didn't realize I was following on from my dear colleague from the Frick. And all I need to say, just to get him going, is, of course, Mr. Frick came to the Wallace first and saw it in 1903 and decided he wanted to do the same thing back home. And he did so very well. But the Wallace, I like to think, remains the piece, the masterpiece that many collectors wanted to emulate when they were bringing together their collections. And so today I would like to tell you a bit more about Sir Richard Wallace. He remains a rather secretive, quite sort of shy collector, even though he collected in the grandest of ways. He had the perfect budget to spend, and he didn't hesitate to buy whole collections, a whole piece. When we celebrated his 200th anniversary last year, he was born in 1818, so 2018, we did an exhibition in our newly exhibition space, our new galleries, and I have to admit, we hesitated what to call the exhibition. Richard Wallace, the enigmatic collector, or the eccentric collector, and in the end I just thought, forget it, let's just call him the collector. But what came up was, first of all, we had to select from the many pieces. We have about just under 6,000 pieces at the Wallace. And out of around, probably about 2,000 pieces were his sort of contribution to this great collection that was started off in the 18th century by the first Marquess of Hertford, and then particularly by the fourth Marquess, his supposed father. More on that later. But what was surprising was that when we selected the objects and had only about 20 in our exhibition galleries, was first of all the diversity, the variety, and the sheer quality of what basically captured his eye as a collector. And I hope in this lecture to really enlighten you, because not only me, but my curators were completely surprised by what they were able to pick out from a Richard Wallace angle. And it was a real sort of a moment of great sort of opening up the collection in different ways. And that's why I've chosen this very surprising object, lying on its side, a head, an African head from the Ashanti kingdom, present-day Ghana, something that he bought in 1872, no less from the royal jeweler Garrard, which I think still exists. And he bought it directly from this jeweler. And it's one of the most surprising things you'd imagine finding that at the Wallace. I don't think the Frick has anything like this, does it? Unlucky. So anyway, I have to admit, when I applied for the job and I saw this, I thought, I have to work here. This is just too good to be true. I've always wanted to work with African art, and at last, here it is. But I'll talk more about it in a minute. I just thought we should start from the beginning. It might sound like a Netflix series, The Wallace Boy, but this is young Wallace as he was when he arrived in Paris, aged 8, 9 years old, and pretty much left by his mother, Mrs. Agnes Jackson, she was called, left with the fourth Marquess's mother, Mimi, or the third Marchioness of Hertford. And there in Paris, just off the Boulevard des Italiens, he grew up. He grew up not where his supposed father lived, the fourth Marquess, which is Rue Lafitte, here on the corner, but just around here, above an ice cream shop known as Tortoni's, best ice cream in Paris at the time. But that's where he grew up, in the company of his supposed granny, and would, of course, I'm sure would have had some kind of relationship with his supposed father, who was the fourth Marquess, as you see here. Now, the fourth Marquess is a fascinating character, and when I was at university, when we went to the Wallace, everything was based on him as the collector. He was the one that brought the great collection of Sèvres porcelain to the Wallace. He also is the one that bought the most extraordinary pictures, including the Laughing Cavalier, which he famously bid against Sir James of Rothschild and outbid him, amazingly, and got the famous Franz Hals. But he was also a complete recluse, somebody who bought but then packed things away and didn't actually show them much, and also would go to sales but not actually bid. And who would he send but the young Wallace? This is the interesting thing. When Wallace, as a young man, expressed an interest in joining the merchant navy, we know that the fourth Marquess said, no, you're staying here. And it seems that the young Richard Wallace became a kind of secretary, an assistant to the great collector. No doubt, fourth Marquess had lots of bills to pay, would need somebody to go on errands, maybe somebody to even bid for him. We do know that Sir Richard Wallace went as far as St. Petersburg to go to some sale there. So he was definitely the sort of more public side of the fourth Marquess's sort of life as a collector. And I just wanted to show you the young Richard Wallace. I've grown to really like him as a character. He seems quite jovial, young, open. Indeed, he met what would be his future wife, Amélie, in a local perfumer's arcade. They never married because apparently his father, the fourth Marquess, never appreciated this liaison, and they would only marry when the fourth Marquess passed away in 1870. But he seems to have been quite a sort of jovial young man, and what we find out is that he goes into debt quite a few times, particularly because he over-collects. He must have had some, well, we do know that he did have an allowance, but he would often overspend. And this is a copy of the catalogue of Richard Wallace's own sale in 1827, which mainly comprises works of art and objects and a few sculptures, but also these wonderful fork, knife and spoon that supposedly belonged to Cardinal Mazarin. And I put them here because they reappeared on the market in the 1870s. And although Richard Wallace had to sell them, he bought them back. He was because, of course, he had to sell them for the money. But when he did have the money, he did go back and get them. And we still have them in our collection. Some fine examples of 17th century knives and forks, cutlery. Now, in terms of taste, it's again quite difficult to ascertain to what extent Richard Wallace and the fourth Marquess were working together, shared the same passion, particularly for the 18th century France in terms of decorative and paintings. We presume that they definitely did, and that they were sort of worked together in accruing this extraordinary collection that is the Wallace in terms of French 18th century art. And here, one of my favorite sort of mise en scène at the Wallace, where you have the beautiful Watteau of a man tuning his lute, with then these Chinese export porcelains mounted in the French style with gilt bronze. So therefore potpourri, and this is for incense. And then you've got this wonderful Louis XV table, and it's just this wonderful sort of assemblage of the arts of France in one. And again, apart from the Frick, there's very few places where you can appreciate this fusion of the different traditions, artistic traditions. Now, this, as I was taught, represents the fourth Marquess's taste, and perhaps it does. It has to be said that when you look at what Richard Wallace collected from 1870 onwards, when he inherited the collection and the wealth that went with it, he commissioned this portrait, in a way, of his collection. And as you can see, it is more of a sort of Kunstkammer. You have all kinds of objects, sculpture, silver, armor, jewelry, collars, all kinds of things that really makes a very surprising view into what the Wallace can also be for certain viewers who look out for such things. I'll come back to this very beautiful still life by Degoff, painted in 1881, as a way of celebrating Richard Wallace's collection. But I just thought it'd be interesting to contrast the two collectors and perhaps their taste in their desire to acquire beautiful works of art. He did, I have to admit, that Richard Wallace did, when he inherited in 1872 from the dealer Dulaca, he did acquire this very beautiful soft-paste Vincennes casket that was created for the Turkish Ottoman market, so it was made for order. But it's interesting that he would have gone straight for it, perhaps because of his father's original desire for such objects. But back to Richard Wallace himself, he does remain this enigmatic character until 1870. His supposed father dies, and to everybody's surprise, he inherits the landed estates in Northern Ireland. He inherits all the property in Paris, around the Boulevard des Italiens, but also we've discovered, and this is something that I urge you to all come to the Wallace shop and buy, but Suzanne Higgett, our curator, has written the most fascinating biography of Richard Wallace. And one thing that she discovered was how much sort of property the Hertfords and Richard Wallace owned in Paris. And a lot of it were basically collecting rents from dealers. And one wonders if, instead of getting the rent, they would get works of art in exchange. That has yet to be researched. But I say to everybody's surprise, mainly because the Marquesses of Hertford, particularly the cousin, really thought that he should inherit. He inherited the title, and the title has been passed down to the present 9th Marquess, who sits on our board of trustees. So the relationship is still a good one. But it has to be said that the 5th Marquess of Hertford was so annoyed that he took Richard Wallace to court, and there was a litigation, and amazingly, because the will was quite sort of precise, it did say that Richard Wallace had inherited the collection and the wealth that went with it. So Richard Wallace, interestingly, rather than sitting on it, becomes or aspires to become the ultimate Victorian philanthropist. And I'm showing you this engraving that was published in the French Gazette des Beaux-Arts, but here's the man himself, beautiful moustache, looking out of this sort of surrounds. And as when you zoom in, you will see these sort of lovely French ladies holding up a child, but holding charity and fortune. And with this fortune and this charitable sort of desire to share it with everybody, as you can see in the lower part on the left, Richard Wallace introduced the concept of fountains, the idea that following the Commune of France, during the Franco-Prussian War, the Parisians were left with very little drinkable water. There was also a terrible problem with alcoholism, and Richard Wallace came up with the concept of commissioning 40 fountains and stopped them around Paris for the poor to drink from. And then he commissioned Le Bourg, a sculptor, to create these 4 figures that support this sort of dome under which the water comes out. And you can see originally they were cups so that you could come and drink from them. The 4 virtues represent kindness, sobriety, charity, and simplicity. All the sort of virtues that I would say one could even sort of allude to in Richard Wallace's own character. He was very much acclaimed for this charitable act by the French, and still is known as Monsieur Wallace, Les Fontaines Wallace. And I've always wondered if Sadiq Khan should come up with a similar idea and have the Sadiq Khan fountains in order to avoid having too much plastic in bottled plastic bottles. But below, interestingly, of this print, we see Espérance, the coat of arms that Richard Wallace takes up, the Espérance with this, as you'll see, the ostrich head holding a horseshoe, with Britannia, the sort of allegory of Britain, England, Boris Johnson giving the hand over to Macron in the form of Gallia here. And you can see there's a sense of wanting to have that entente cordiale between the two countries. Anyway, it's true that Richard Wallace remained a British citizen living in Paris. He went to a Protestant church. He set up the Hertford Hospital for British expats. So he spoke beautiful French, I'm sure, but he remained an Englishman in Paris. And that's, again, something worth bearing in mind. The coat of arms is an interesting one, because, of course, being an illegitimate child and not ever knowing who his true father was, and also he never really sort of made contact with his mother. The idea of wanting to find his own sort of pedigree as such, he came up with this coat of arms of the ostrich holding a horseshoe. And as you probably know, the horseshoe in an ostrich's beak refers to the idea that ostriches can digest metal. This is an old legend that goes right back to antiquity. But you could feed ostriches with metal and they would digest it. And this became a symbol of fortitude, and therefore was taken up as a sort of perfect coat of arms. Amazingly, ostriches can digest one small nail, so it's quite an extraordinary feat. But one thing is that at a sale in Paris, this very beautiful 16th century Augsburg piece of silver representing an ostrich with a horseshoe came up, and he went for it straight away. And it's one of the great silversmiths' works that we have at the Wallace. And one of my curators did some research and discovered that it belonged to the confraternity of the ostrich in southern Germany. So there's a sort of interesting sort of tradition in that sort of symbolic quality. But again, interesting that Richard Wallace would sort of almost see himself when he saw this ostrich coming up for sale. Now, as a man, he definitely became the sort of English dandy. He decided in late 1870, to bring the whole collection back to London. It is said for safekeeping. He had witnessed the Palais des Tuileries burning down during the Commune. He was very nervous that that might happen to the collection that he had inherited. And I wouldn't be surprised if his father, before dying, said, I want you to look after this collection. Not only, make sure that it survives, but you can add to it and you can, keep it together as such. And so he does come back to London, and he comes back as this Victorian dandy. Here he is, standing with his top hat, cigar in the left hand, looking out. This was published in the Vanity Fair, and he was sort of coined by William Gladstone as the most fortunate man of his day because of this incredible collection that he had inherited. He buys back the house, the family house, Hertford House in Manchester Square, which today houses the Wallace Collection, from the 5th Marquess, because interestingly, Richard Wallace did not inherit that. So he buys it back, but he decides that he needs to refurbish it. It's not big enough, or the space is not adequate enough to receive the collection. So he decides to send the collection, or a large part of it, to Bethnal Green, which is today, of course, the Museum of Childhood and is run by the V&A. But in those days, it was an exhibition space, and there was the collection for about a year and a half. About 3 million visitors came to it. It was an extraordinary success. The Prince of Wales opened it, and there are these wonderful prints of the working class, it is said, admiring these beautiful objects from 18th century France, to the extent that this became the first outreach program that any museum could be proud of. But it's undoubtedly inspired Richard Wallace to one day think of making his private collection public, and I'm sure the Bethnal Green experience was to stay with him. Interestingly, one of the visitors to Bethnal Green was the young Van Gogh. He was at the time working for Goupil, the dealers, particularly photographic reproductions. And here he is. But one picture that he was obsessed about that was exhibited at the Bethnal Green exhibition was this painted by Ary Scheffer of Margaret at the Well. He just loved the sort of moral sort of undertones of this picture, the fact that she, a virtuous woman, would come to the well and always hear her girlfriends discuss their boyfriends, and she'd think, they're wasting so much time. And one day she turns up and she's pregnant herself. And of course, Van Gogh just took a lot of delight in this sort of moral conundrum. It's a picture that he writes back to his brother Theo. But just to give you an idea that the Wallace Collection was so acclaimed for its quality, for the pictures, it was well known. And indeed, Vanity Fair sort of writes about his, and I quote, his collection of pictures, one of the very finest in the world. He has given to be exhibited not to the rich in the West End, but to the poor of Bethnal Green. He sits in Parliament as a liberal. He has naturally been selected as a member of various artistic bodies, and he is, on the whole, as good as the best of those who have lately been adopted into the ranks of the English aristocracy. So you can see that he's wanting to elevate his status within society. When he finishes, finally, the refurbishment of Hertford House, one of the great sort of pieces or rooms that he opens up above the stables is the Great Gallery. Here it is in one of the early photographs that has survived. And it's fascinating to see how he organized the collection, how he mixed furniture, sculpture with the paintings, and also how he hung the paintings. I have to say, as a curator of paintings, he hangs well. He knows how to balance things out. He knows how to provide interesting comparisons. For example, you've got the Philippe de Champagne, a great classicist, in contrast with two big Watteaus. On the other side, where we're standing, you've got the two wonderful Van Dycks with the Rubens landscape in the middle. Everything is very beautifully balanced, and yet art historically has really wonderful conversations to be had. And this is the way the gallery looks like today. I have to say that the hang looks much thinner, even though I keep thinking there's too many pictures hanging. But it gives you an idea of the space and the height and how glorious it would have looked in the late 1870s. Indeed, Disraeli, who is one of the first visitors, calls it this palace of fancy and taste because it was so well known. The visitor book that we have, which was signed by Disraeli, is a great sort of testimony to who came to the Wallace between 1877 and 1890. When Richard Wallace died, you've got Le Gros Ionides, and you've got the young Rodin, the sculptor, who also came. And it'd be fascinating to try and see what he might have been excited about when he came to the collection. And Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, sorry, not museum, but the lady Isabella Stewart Gardner came as well, amongst many other American collectors. So it was a sort of mecca for the collectors of the day to come and admire what Richard Wallace had put together. Richard Wallace, as a social figure, was not only a trustee at the National Gallery, but he was a great, very generous lender to exhibitions. This is him at the 1888 British Academy show. You've got his two large Van Dycks, portraits of Philippe and Madame Leroy. Indeed, Richard Wallace is standing here. You've got John Layton, the painter, and many other very important Victorian figures standing with him. These are the two Van Dycks that he lent, that you see at the background here. Two of our wonderful portraits by Van Dyck. And he even helped the National Gallery acquire paintings at certain times, but also gave them paintings. This is the Treaty of Münster, a very important picture that shows the brokering of the peace between Spain and the Dutch, and is a historically important picture, but also a very important painting by Terborch. And here's the letter giving the picture to the National Gallery. He, being a great philanthropist, was committed to charitable acts such as setting up the Lifeboat Association in Southampton. He, of course, received many letters, the kind of letters I write to potential patrons, saying, like, will you help us with our extension? And these are all the letters that he received, and very politely said, no, I'm running out of money. But he kept all the letters asking him for money, so something that is worth looking at in our archives. But back to that still life I showed you earlier. It's a still life that I think reflects perfectly the kind of collector Richard Wallace wanted to be remembered as. A collector that collected like a Renaissance prince, that was interested in many different art forms, but for things that you could handle, you could look at, you could put in different contexts, maybe touch and open up in some cases. Here he is, much older, in the 1880s, holding a very beautiful Argadi piece of bronze sculpture. He's dressed, interestingly, in his smoking jacket. He liked his hookah pipes, and we still have his hookah pipes, but he would have a nice smoke in the evenings in his, what he called his smoking room, which is this wonderful room that is just off the restaurant. The restaurant is here today, through here. And it was here that he would bring things in and handle them. He even had we can't see it now, but there was a door just here that went straight into the street, so visitors could come in and out, so unannounced, so that they could smoke the hookah pipes and look at some beautiful art. But this room, which still exists, I mean, it doesn't look like this, as you'll see in a minute, but it was covered with the most beautiful tiles done in the Iznik style. This is what the room looks like today. But if your eagle eye cuts to the right corner here, you'll see a room where the tiles are still there. And it's astonishing to imagine this beautiful blues and turquoise blues with wonderful mosaic floor domineering this whole room. Now, ceramics, presumably because it was trying to be oriental as a theme. These are done by Minton and Co., and they predate, interestingly, Leighton House. So Leighton must have come round and been delighted to see this and decided to do something similar back at his studio house. But it'd be wonderful one day to sort of try and reconstruct this beautiful room that is covered with these tiles, Iznik in style tiles. And indeed, he collected Iznik porcelain and plates. So the interest is definitely reflected, his interest in the art is reflected in the decor. And again, this is another photo of how it looked originally. Why it was dismantled is the biggest crime to the Wallace Collection. We don't know, there's no paperwork, but it sounds as if it was a reason of taste, and it was done in the 1960s, so relatively recently. And all we have now is red damask on top. And I have knocked on the wall to see if it's at the back, but it all got stripped away, very sadly. But in this room, one could do something that really reflects Richard Wallace. One of the conundrums we have at the Wallace is there's nowhere in the Wallace Collection where we can celebrate the founder, Sir Richard, where we can really explain who he was. And I think this space could be a great area to really try and capture his character and his collecting habits. And at the moment, we have the Maiolica, we've got a mix of coins and medals, we've got ivories, we've got these extraordinary incense burners, which we found in storage. They've never been seen before, and they were brought upstairs. We will try and display them a bit better than with this sort of boxing ring kind of cordon here. But they are the most astonishing pieces, and we're doing some research, and they actually are 18th century, Shillong period, and they're actually very important. But they would work very beautifully in this oriental room where you could have this wonderful meeting of West and East in one space. Also in this room is, of course, the Iznik plates that I spoke about, so they would fit very beautifully. And I think sometimes you could bring also out the wonderful Ashanti head that I showed you earlier. This is a piece that is essentially one of the great sort of full-size, life-size head portraits of an Ashanti chief. We don't know exactly if it's a chief or a victim whose head has been cut off, because we do know that these would be attached to swords and then brought back to life in a way by these sort of ceremonial dances. But it is the most extraordinary feat in not only in gold sort of modeling, but also in realism, with these eyes, the nostrils, the lips, and then these sort of ivory bits coming through the lips. As I said, it was brought back it was looted at the Battle of Kumasi. It was then auctioned in South Africa and bought by Garrard, and Garrard sold off the pieces to individual collectors. And this is how it looked in the gallery at Garrard's. And you can see that the trophy head was one of the centerpieces. Richard Wallace also bought the two swords, which we also have. These are very fascinating pieces that really deserve to be researched, deserve to be seen alongside other Ashanti pieces, and also we have to be transparent with their origin and really tell the true story behind them, and we do that in the label, but we should do it more publicly, I'm sure. The other piece that Richard Wallace bought was this extraordinary Irish Celtic bell, an 11th, 10th century bell known as the Bell of St. Mura. St. Mura was from County Donegal. This is meant to have come from the monastery there. And it's a bell that was meant to be miraculous. If you drank from it, you would be assured a good birth if you were pregnant. And it was also used by the monks to evangelize the area of County Donegal. And when you look at it closely, you'll see there's wonderful Celtic decoration, but you'll see the rock crystal here with the red amber. Unfortunately, it's missing there, but that's the red amber that's symbolizing the wounds of Christ. So this is basically the crucifixion with the body of Christ in the middle, but in abstract form. And I'm sure that these cavities originally contained relics. But it's an astonishing survival of Celtic art. There are very few bells like this, the most famous one being the Bell of St. Patrick, which is in Dublin today. He also bought this horn of St. Hubert. And you can see that, the Bell St. Mura belonged to St. Mura. The Ashanti head, belonged to the Ashanti, but he's very interested in who would have used these objects. There's a sort of sense of interest in biography. And this is the horn of St. Hubert, who had led a dissolute life, drinking and lots of ladies, but one day as he was about to shoot down a stag, had a vision of the crucifix between the horns of the antler the antlers, and he decided to convert to Catholicism. And this is the horn he was blowing that day. This is the relic, and it was a highly prized object in 19th century France. And Richard Wallace bought it for a good 51,000 francs, which is an enormous price at the time. And it's a fascinating medieval object, which today might not look like much, like a cow horn, but actually, when you get close to it, you'll see the decorations and architectural decorations on it that reveal a very interesting medieval sort of world. The other piece that he bought was the Henry IV's dagger, a dagger that was presented to him, to Henry IV in 1600, when Henry IV decided to marry Maria de' Medici, and famously said that Paris is worth a mass. And so he converted to Catholicism. And this is the key dagger that symbolizes this union. It's, again, a very important piece and should be in Paris in the Musée de l'Armée alongside its scabbard, but has made it to the Wallace Collection because Richard Wallace acquired it again for a phenomenal sum of money. So, again, it belonged to somebody of great note, such as Henry IV. And then he bought, most surprisingly, at the Allègre sale, one of the great French collectors, these two cups that are golden, as you can see, decorated with very precious stones, with dragons. They're Chinese. You've got the Chinese script above. They belonged to the Shillong emperor, and this Chinese script says, "May there be peace in my territories." These are the cups he would drink from on New Year's Eve. There are only 4 in the world, and 2 happen to be at the Wallace. For a long time, nobody knew that they were at the Wallace, but they're sort of last 20 years been a very important discovery, and yet still very little research had been done for them. But because of Richard Wallace exhibition, we did a bit more research. And the astonishing thing is, when you get closer to it, a lot of us thought that, like most people, that this was sort of a blue enamel, but actually it's kingfisher feathers that decorate the inlay, this most beautiful pure blue. So they are incredibly important. And as I said, only 4 of these exist, and 2 at Wallace. And we go from China to Indo-Portuguese art. This is Goan from present-day Goa. A Christ child made out of rock crystal sitting on a small cushion in the sort of the Christ as the young shepherd. And they must be made for export by indigenous artists, but indigenous artists who could have easily done a young Vishnu, but in this case was asked to make a young Christ. It's this big, and again, there are only about 5 of these in the world. And it's fascinating that Richard Wallace should be going for such objects, and very unlike any collector at the time. These are kind of objects that the British Museum would be desperate to buy even today. And jewelry, the 15th century Renaissance jewelry, some of it might not be totally correct. It might be, and that's the interesting aspect of what Richard Wallace sometimes did buy fakes, and he would have been tricked. And the jewelry is still an area that we need to research properly. But he definitely was very proud of them, because you can see them in the still lifes here of the painting he commissioned. Now, I spoke about the smoking room, but the other galleries that very much reflect his taste are the 16th century galleries, which look like this today, but they were originally 2 rooms split into 2. And this was one room with, again, wonderful sort of maiolica hanging on the wall, which is a very interesting way of thinking of maybe showing our maiolica one day, with these wonderful pieces of sculpture by Algardi in the middle, which show Jupiter and Juno. But these belong to Philip IV, King of Spain, incredibly important pieces. They're now in the Louis XIV room, and although they look great there, they're very lost. They look more decorative. They're actually highly important pieces of sculpture. And it would be great if we could maybe rethink how Richard Wallace displays his own collection and try and emulate it to a certain extent, because he did get things very right most of the time in terms of how he displayed his collection. He also bought these beautiful Ferdinando Tacas, 2 angels that would have been for an altar. Again, astonishing sculpture. You wouldn't imagine to find these great Baroque pieces at the Wallace, and they're pushed right against the wall, and most people walk past them. So I think there's a lot more one could do. And then in this one of the cabinet, probably one of the greatest Renaissance pieces of sculpture out of boxwood, of Hercules. It's an astonishing piece. It's about this big. It's the way it's balanced, the way it's carved, the sheer polish and the anatomy is sensational and should be sort of regarded as the Michelangelo David of London in a way. And with this, of course, in terms of boxwood, we also have one of the greatest masterpieces of this little triptych that you open up and you have this microcosm of a religious world, of a biblical world within, something again that Richard Wallace bought from the Nieuwekerk collection in 1873. So these are the objects we selected and put into our new exhibition space. And it was quite something to really sort of extrapolate them from the busyness of our collection and give them space. And it has to be said, suddenly a very different collector came through, and it was extremely gratifying for us. And this is the last object that Richard Wallace bought. I mean, he really collected till the end of his life. This is 1888, £300 from a dealer called Davies. A beautiful sculpture by Bartholomew Prieur, late 16th century French, Italian-inspired, but also highly original in his approach, and an acrobat, a man doing a handstand. For me, it's the most astonishing piece of sculpture. And I wonder if Rodin would have absolutely loved this. It would have been a real eye-opener for him. But it's just such a tour de force to see this young figure in the act of equilibrium. Weirdly, we don't know much, but he seems to have been very depressed in the last 5 years of his life. He had lost his only son, Edmond. They had fallen out because Edmond had fallen in love with an actress lady, and he sort of disowned him. But he did nevertheless go back to Paris, Richard Wallace, and spent the last 2 years of his life there in Bagatelle, in this lovely sort of mini palace just outside Paris in the Bois de Boulogne, a wonderful 18th century pleasure house originally built by the Comte d'Artois. And he passed away there in 1890 without his lady wife, Lady Wallace. She, for some reason, stayed back in London. This is the cortège when he was taken to Bagatelle. You can tell, to a certain extent, that people lamented his death, the great philanthropist. Indeed, the French have said for a long time that they were very vexed when Richard Wallace didn't actually leave the collection to the French state, and they always wondered whether it was because he hadn't received the Légion d'honneur. That's not true. He did receive it, but it's interesting that he decided to die in Paris, and indeed he is buried in Bagatelle. Worth, if you're a Wallace fanatic as I am, to go and lay down a rose on his tomb. But interestingly, the tomb says Hertford Wallace, so there is real sense of the unity in terms of going back and lying next to his father, or supposed father, because we still have no proof, unless we exhume them. But what happens to the collection? There was great sort of anxiety back in London on news of his death, who would take on the collection. And indeed, the Times on the 22nd of July said, the ungracious question forces itself forward. What will happen to the pictures now, to the collection now? He has left no child. His only son died 3 years ago. And common gossip has for a long time declared that he intended to leave everything to the nation, or to the two nations, Hertford House and its contents to England and the rest to France. Now, Lady Wallace did survive him. Here she is. She looks rather intimidating in black. She is here in mourning, sitting outside the Hertford House, in what is today the restaurant. She, in 1894, declared in her will that the collection should come to the British nation. And indeed, when the museum opened in 1900 to the public, it was she who would greet you at the top of the staircase with this wonderful plaque above her head. The husband is relegated to the right, and she is right in the middle. And the plaque, which weirdly I found in the shop above a doorway, completely illegible, is actually the keystone to the Wallace. It's almost the beginning of the Wallace. The Wallace collection bequeathed to the British nation by Emily, widow of Sir Richard Wallace. And that was in 1997. And then in 1900, it opened to the public. Prince of Wales opened it, and Henry Clay Frick came in 1903. Thank you very much.